have lots of thoughts and I have lots of questions. And I think, even just kind of diving into the stuff that's so top of mind for me, like my introduction to you and your work was on the Dear Sugars podcast. And I love that podcast with Cheryl Strayed and Dave Allman. And you appeared on their Dark Fantasies episode, where a woman wrote in and was talking about why she gets turned on by things that really disturb her. And that has been a question I've had, and something that I think I'm sure lots of people wonder, why, when I live this life, do I seemingly have this erotic world or this sexual or erotic part of my mind that completely doesn't connect with who I am or what I think I like. And I think just that distinction, if you can even talk about why there is this separation between our everyday lives, us as just working, home life people, and our sexual lives. Like, why is there even that distinction?
That's a big question. So why is there a distinction between sort of our, lived lives and our sex lives or our fantasy lives? Well, that's interesting. I think a lot of times in our, lived lives, we have to live, very cognitively. We're focused on sort of communication and getting along, and we're very much in this sort of like egalitarian space, especially in our relationships. But I think that there is something about sex and arousal and desire that is, extremely raw, extremely primal, extremely elemental. And I think the language that we have to like make a list to go to Whole Foods and what to buy, or I just don't think that is the language of eros. And I think that sex is our sexuality is an incredibly important form of a part of our identity and our expression. I think we all have sexual selves that want to speak and be out there in the world as much as our professional selves and relational selves. I think most of us end up growing up in what I would call either sex negative homes or sex avoidant homes. So sex was either something that was, a little mired in shame or negativity, or it was avoided as a topic altogether. So something that is so important and so, embedded in our DNA is completely unmodeled. We never have language for it. It's never mirrored for us. So it's inherently an aspect of our lives that is unmirrored and somewhat therefore dysregulated, unlike so many other parts of our lives that are supported and tutored and scaffolded for how to be out there in the world. So I think automatically almost thinking about sex, and I think thinking about our fantasies and our erotic selves is unknown and mysterious and dangerous, because we've only ever really gotten to look at it through a lens that's either negative or avoided. And we just simply don't have enough language to describe our internal states around sexuality.
Right. You mentioned something in that Dear Sugars episode about our society is decently like sexually repressive. Like even if we live in a hypersexualized culture that, hypersexualizes young women, or we have music that's really explicit, our culture and our society in general is somewhat sexually repressive in the sense that we're not having very many public, open, healthy conversations about sex. Exactly to your point. It's not part of this like public discourse necessarily. So, and I often wonder, like, if it were, what would that necessarily look like? Like, in what ways as a society what differences would we start to see kind of on a macro holistic level if we did live in this, idealized world where our sex lives are as much a part of the conversation as, how many kids we're having, or like what grow.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question. So what would the world look like, or what would our lived lives look like, or our lived sex lives look like if we were just living in a very sex positive world?
Yeah.
Well, I'll throw a couple of things out and then maybe you throw a couple of things out, okay?
Yeah.
I would say, first of all, that we would live without a lot of the anxiety that most of us live with around sex. And so I would think in living without that anxiety, or being able to communicate about that anxiety, or being able to talk about our emotions and feelings around sex the way we talk about our emotions and feelings in other areas, um, I think we would feel much safer with sexuality as a topic. So I think, as a sex therapist, I see so much sexual dysfunction. I see in men so much erectile disorder in young guys your age, guys in their late teens, 20s, early 30s. It's not physical, it's psychological, and it's totally rooted in anxiety around what it means to have actual connected sex. So I think first and foremost, we'd have a lot less anxiety stored in our bodies. And so we'd be a lot more embodied and connected to our bodies and our sex lives. I can throw out something else, but maybe I'll let you respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think we would see a lot less violence. Because like right now I'm reading, actually on my bedside table is Liz Plank's For the Love of Men, her
Mm-hmm.
book on toxic masculinity,
Mm-hmm.
and how toxic masculinity and this idea of like men have to be a certain way is like one of the more deeply rooted issues in society that cause a lot of violence. And when you look at more peaceful societies around the board, like one of the through lines between them all is like the lack of violence against women.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a society that has violence against women, that has toxic masculinity, it's like a less functional society as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, and going back to what you were saying about this anxiety men have around their sexuality or can have, yeah, I feel like if we were more open about it, if it wasn't this, if
Mm-hmm.
sexuality and power and masculinity were all somehow decoupled from each other, we would
Sure.
see less violence
Right.
in general.
Yeah, I think that's true. And when I speak of the anxiety, I'm also speaking of anxiety that men hold, women hold, people of all identities and orientations, we're all holding a lot of that, anxiety. I think the other thing that would happen is we'd be much more willing to be creative about sex. And hey, just like in life, like I'm going to forge my own path. I'm going to go my own way. I'm going to buck the system. I'm going to be nonconformist and non-conventional. I'm going to be highly individualistic, right? That's how we live our lives. Not when it comes to sex, though. Most of us, when it comes to sex, is like, especially with heterosexual couples, we should be getting to intercourse. If we're not having intercourse is a dominant activity that leads to orgasms, that has a certain amount of positions. In some ways, we're not doing sex correctly, right? So there's this huge repressive, dominant, patriarchal, religious narrative around what sex is supposed to look like that we've really internalized. So I think certainly if we were in a more sex positive society, we would allow ourselves. I wrote a book called So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex, which just is this idea that our sex lives get lived through action, and a sexual event is a series of behaviors that are emotional, psychological, physical, and that we sort of have like sex scripts. And we have sex scripts that work and that we feel really comfortable in. And a lot of the time, our sex scripts don't work and they're reinforcing, a problem or an issue. And where are we getting these sex scripts that don't work? We're kind of pulling them out of the dominant narratives that overshadow us. So I think if we lived in a more sex positive world, we'd be willing to advocate and be more creative around what sex looks like.
Right. So knowing that you are a sex therapist and you help couples or you help individuals work through either issues that they're having or ideally getting them towards healthier and more gratifying, sexual lives and sexual selves. Um, so when you kind of talk about the sex scripts, and walking through the beginning, middle, and end, what are you seeing? What is something that typically happens in the beginning? When does it begin, the sex script?
Uh-huh. That's okay. So let's talk through a sex script and some of the issues, impasses, and discrepancies that I see. Right. I think the main issues and discrepancies probably happen in that first phase around desire. And couples, I mean, I see this a lot with couples of all ages. That there are a lot of libido issues. There's a lot of sex ruts. There's a lot of mismatched libidos. And I think what a lot of it comes down to is individuals each sort of have their own desire framework. And when we try and get together for sex, our frameworks sometimes clash with each other and we don't have enough empathy or insight into our partner's framework. And if we kind of were able to sort of understand our desire framework a little better and appreciate our partners, we could create a shared desire framework. So that probably sounds a little abstract. So what am I actually talking about? What do I mean by that, right? Two terms that get talked about a lot, Nomi, I don't know if you talk about this in your work with desire, is the difference between sort of spontaneous and responsive desire. A lot of men, but also women, they're in what would be called sort of like a spontaneous desire paradigm. They can kind of gobble up and metabolize a sexual cue very quickly. My hot wife is getting out of the shower and I see her in the towel, and that cue, that one visual cue, really gets processed very quickly and creates physical sexual arousal in me. So that would be sort of like spontaneous desire. And I think that that's kind of the cultural paradigm for desire, right? Like you turn on Netflix, you watch a show, you watch a movie. Two people see each other across a room. Next thing you know, they're sort of in each other's arms, pulling off each other's clothes. So, that's certainly one desire framework. It's considered spontaneous and fiery and unpredictable and lusty and romantic. But what if that's not how you experience desire? Which in people's lived lives is often not, So does that mean you're broken? Certainly, the pharmaceutical industry would say, "Yeah, let's give you a pill and get you sort of operating in the this sort of dominant desire framework." So there's been a lot of research done mainly by feminist sexual researchers. Going back to people like Betty Dodson and Rosemary Bassoon. And I don't know if you've come across a book called Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski, which is a great book. But this idea that for some people, sexual desire is more responsive, right? There has to be something that comes before it in order for desire to emerge. And what that really is sort of a feeling of arousal in some ways, a feeling of allowing whatever turns you on to get you turned on, and whatever turns you off, whether it's a sexual behavior or a kid in the other room or a roommate, to turn off, So some people don't experience that level of spontaneous desire. They experience desire differently, and they need a different kind of environment or context for desire to happen. So it's very likely that two people are in different frameworks and they're going to clash. The person in the spontaneous desire framework might say, "Why am I always initiating? Why am I always the one that feels desire? What's wrong with my partner? Why am I not desired? Why are they not coming on to me? Like I want to have that feeling, And for the person who's a little more of a responsive framework, they might feel like, why doesn't this person like appreciate other things? That why is it always sex, sex, sex? Or why am I not that interested in sex a lot of the time?" So I'll help people sort of talk about what their sort of inherent desire framework might be and how to create a desire framework that allows them both to kind of launch into a sex script.
Me and my girlfriends talk about a lot that, like, the lead up starts, it's like the beginning of the day, like, are we being affectionate throughout the day? Or maybe we're on a date and we're having a really intimate conversation, and that something that seems like it gets lost sometimes. Like it's so kind of on and in sync in the dating phase that, you know, you're meeting up and there's this level of excitement that almost like naturally sort of flows into, you know, an erotic situation like later in the night, but that something happens in the transition of like dating, puppy love phase into the like settling into a relationship, maybe moving in together, and how kind of day to day life is just not as sexy as
Yeah.
like dating life. And, you know, how we talk a lot about like, how can you still infuse some of that into your day to day life? Like, you know, still being able to establish a connection or making sure you have date nights or whatever it is that puts you in that more romantic frame of mind. Um, but you know, I have like some friends in particular, and I don't know if this is because the state of the world we're in, but that lead up, like getting into that feeling of intimacy and connection, is just so much more difficult, or feels more difficult when we're in, especially this sort of like pandemic world of we're in sweats all day. I see you from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep. Like there's nothing to talk about. I'm anxious. I'm working
Hmm.
from home. I'm stuck in the same place. Like the last thing I feel like doing is having sex, because it's like I don't feel very sexy, like, or my mind is so preoccupied. Is that something you're seeing? Is there reason to believe that our sex lives can and have been impacted by like what's going on in the world right now?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, when COVID first hit, my practice took a little bit of a nosedive. Patients went a little radio silent, which is fine. I love getting a break from things. But I was like, oh, finally, people have time to have sex, and there's no more excuses like around being too busy, too obligated, the commute, too tired. And I'm going to be out of business because everybody's finally having more sex because there's nothing else to do. So, you know, let's do it. But nope, within about 2 weeks, you know, everything was back and more in demand than ever. And what COVID shows us is how fascinating and complex and beautiful sexuality is. I mean, there are so many variables and factors that combine and go into creating sexual energy, right? So now what we're seeing, as you just mentioned, you know, we are there's a physiological, a biological element. We are not eating as well. We're not exercising as much. You know, we are smoking a lot more. A lot of people have gone back to nicotine and back to cigarettes. You know, we are drinking a lot more, but not just to have a glass of wine, but really in somewhat maladaptive ways. So all of that, we're taking more SSRIs that have sexual side effects. You know, so there's a physiological dimension, as you said. There's also like well, there's a psychological dimension. Like we're not feeling our sexiest. We're not feeling attractive. We're not getting external validation. Our sexual self-esteem isn't at its highest, and we're, as you said, we're like not changing out of our pajamas or taking showers or brushing our teeth as much. You know. And then relationally, like you just said, we're living on top of each other, right? So there's a kind of a claustrophobia, and we're so much more near experience to our partners in a, you know, in a day-to-day way. So I think all of that is these are all, it's creating issues that always existed: low desire, sexual boredom, you know, a lack of interest, certain kinds of sexual dysfunction. But I think that COVID has really intensified and amplified it. So COVID, I do not believe, has been very kind to our sex lives.
Right.
But it's spring, and it's going to be a
Right.
sexy spring, and it's going to be a sexy summer.
It's gonna be a sexy summer. Yeah. And I feel like you know, I'm speaking from a place of, you know, I live with my fiance and a lot of my friends also live with their partners, but I have a lot of single friends that are ready to go and ready to get out there. You know, they haven't really been able to have connection. So agreed. Like I feel like this summer and spring hopefully will be a sexually joyous spring and summer. Um, Something I was thinking about and kind of reading through your work is, obviously knowing you help couples, you help individuals. How would you know, or how would one know if they have a healthy sex life? Like how I I understand that there's some obvious things with like physical sexual dysfunction, or maybe if a couple isn't having sex at all, or they're very dissatisfied with each other. But I mean, what is a healthy sex life?
Well, that's such an interesting question. I mean, I think to me, people come in when they are. I mean, people come to see me like they should have seen me sometimes years earlier. It's kind of like going to the dentist and you've just had this tooth pain that you've been living with, and you just want to get out of pain. So I think most people are aware of when they're not living a healthy sex life, when they're not living up to their sexual potential, when they're not able to get absorbed in the sex with their partner, when they're not able to experience pleasure, when they're not having orgasms, when they're experiencing some kind of erotic conflict. The sex they're having doesn't line up with the sex that they, want to be having. So, in some ways, I would say, sexual health can look like a lot of things, but it's certainly when you're not ruminating, or you don't feel like you've, exiled some part of your sexuality, or that your sex life is, suffering, or that you've had to bottle up or self-silence, aspects of your wants and desires. Sometimes people have um, unrealistic notions of what a healthy sex life should be when, I mean, who am I to say, but they might already be having a healthy sex life. I mean, I've been married for, 20 plus years, and we have kind of routines and little rituals around sex, date nights, and things like that. And someone might say, well, that's a very routine, predictable, boring sex life. But you know what? I would say quite the opposite. It's been incredibly rich and pleasurable, and what it always seems to work. And so I guess it's kind of a subjective question. But again, I come back to: is there something about your sexuality that you're exiling? Is there something about your lived sex life that's not allowing you to feel authentic or expansive, or to feel pleasure?
Hmm. Your um your first book, She Comes First, um, which is just awesome. And I will link for all my readers to be able to access that, as well as the current book. So tell me about the last time you had sex. But you have a term that you kind of reference fairly frequently in interviews and things, called cliteracy.
Hmm.
Could you just tell us what cliteracy is and means, and how you use it?
Sure. Well, I think that so when I was like your age or younger, I really struggled with sexuality, and I was very erotic. I was very sexual. I was in my mind very turned on and pervy all the time, but I just didn't have the sexual function to really express myself the way I wanted. So I felt extremely debilitated just because of sexual dysfunction. And I work with so many young men who feel the same way, whether they're dealing with erectile impairment, or early ejaculation, or some kind of issue. But the thing is, in comparison to how I thought I was supposed to be having sex, I felt extremely diminished. And so, really, my college career was sort of minoring in sexual research in terms of how to become a better lover. It was all just me reading on my own, and there was no internet, and there weren't decent magazines or voices like yourself. So I had to go to Alfred Kinsey and Masters and Johnson, and all these big um, data books. And at a certain point, I discovered, wow, even if I could have the erection I needed to have, or if I could last as long as I wanted to, or I thought I needed to, it doesn't mean I'm heterosexual. It doesn't mean that my female partners would enjoy sex at all. And I really learned about sort of becoming clitorate, going from illiterate to becoming clitorate, and really learning that Well, the clitoris is the powerhouse of the female orgasm. Most of the sensitive nerve endings that power pleasure for women are located on the surface of the vulva. They respond to stimulation more than penetration. In terms of the external parts of the clitoris, the glands, or what's typically the part of the clitoris that's most often stimulated or highly stimulated. There's a distance between the glands of the clitoris, or some people just call that the clitoris, and the vaginal entrance. And that can be anywhere from like 3 to 6 centimeters. And that distance actually matters a lot, particularly when it comes to intercourse, because most intercourse positions fail to adequately, persistently, consistently stimulate the clitoris. So in getting clitorate, it was sort of like getting out from under the shadow of what I call the intercourse discourse and really embracing outer course, and different sexual behaviors that were much more in tune with a realistic formulation of female sexuality. So that sort of being clitorate is really honoring the centrality of the clitoris in female pleasure and creating sex scripts and sexual experiences for anyone who's having sex with somebody that has a clitoris, that honor that.
And sticking on female specific arousal. So something you've talked about that I'm like, oh my God, yes, is this like flow state
Yep.
that women need to get into to relax, to become aroused. And it was so fascinating to me because you, in that same Dark Fantasies episode, with this woman talking about why am I turned on by rape fantasies or incest fantasies, like why does that get me off, or why do I keep thinking about that? And you sort of talked about how women almost need to dissociate or completely transition from this sort of day-to-day stress of everyday life, the things you're constantly thinking about, into like, it's like your brain has to shut off almost for you to kind of just relax into a place where you can even be aroused. And I have found that to be so true, of just like, it takes a while, and I have a like amazing patient, partner, but that I have experienced that of just needing to like go someplace else,
Right.
mentally, in order to kind of just like settle in. So, I mean, do you have any sense of why for women, sex, sexuality, arousal, eroticism is such a psychological process?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, you're right that good sex, especially for women, more so than for men, although again, we're always trying to talk about creating a sex script, a shared sex script that works for both partners. Women need to sort of turn on and get really engaged and absorbed in the sex that they're having. And that's where just all the fun stuff of attraction and connection and novelty come into play. But as women are getting more aroused and closer to orgasm, there have been some really fascinating studies that have shown that as the sexual brain is kind of lighting up, the part of the brain that's really associated with sexual sensation in the body, other parts of the brain that are kind of more focused on the outside environment are shutting down. And so women, unlike men, are kind of going from this place of getting very, very, very turned on, and in doing so, kind of almost really turning off and going into that flow state. So it is really important that our sex scripts really account for that, and create a space for a kind of a prolonged mutual flow state to occur between partners. And psychologically, as you noted, fantasy is a great way to do that. Fantasy is a great way to get turned on, and it's a great way to distract yourself or go into something or get out of the world. And people are often kind of afraid of their fantasies. Like, you listen to that what was it,
Your
the
sugars.
your Sugar's the Dark Fantasies episode. And fantasies inherently, well, let's think about it. What is a fantasy? Well, what is a fantasy? I'll ask you that, Nomi. I have my own idea. It's very simple, but what is a fantasy to you?
I think a fantasy is something, I think by nature, it's something completely unlike your lived life.
hmm I think that that can be true. Although, couldn't you have a fantasy about the sex that you're having with your fiance and really get turned on and enjoy it? Doesn't have to be something that's like totally like your alter identity or something like that, you know?
Yeah, it's like a mental movie.
It is a mental movie, right? Definitely a mental movie. I think if I'm just talking out loud here, I think a fantasy. So let's say it's a mental movie. It can be a watched movie that becomes mentally processed, or it can be a mental movie that we create ourselves, and that's a whole nother discussion about our imaginations versus, say, porn or the images that we're often, spoon fed. But let's just say, to your definition, it's a mental movie that does something unique. It gets us aroused, right? So it gets us aroused. So fantasies get us aroused. That's fantastic. If you have a healthy sex positive approach to sexuality, you can have a very, very healthy approach to your fantasies and really just luxuriate in them and allow yourself to be aroused by them and let them take you wherever they want to take you, which may not be into the lived world at all. It may just be in the sharing of a fantasy. But if your sex life is messed up in some way, as most of us are in some way. I had a messed up sex life for a while, and a lot of my patients do. And again, you come back to this idea that we mostly are growing up in sex, negative or sex avoidant homes. There's a lot about sex that makes it difficult, that makes it anxiety provoking, that makes it hard to settle into the experience, right? Trauma can come up, your history can come up, embarrassment and shame can come up, pain can come up. There's just so many things that can come up that stop arousal in its tracks. So fantasy is a very powerful way of always generating arousal. And sometimes fantasies operate in a curious way. You said, like, why do we sometimes have these dark fantasies or these weird fantasies or these turn ons? To answer that question, I'd really have to sit down with you and learn more about your life and your sex life. But I would say that our fantasies are ways of generating images that turn us on, that help us work around the issues that are getting in the way of our arousal.
I don't know what I was looking at recently. I had to look up some term I came across, and it was some sexual fetish, and it was like the fetishization of, I think, like it was maybe like pressing, being fully clothed and like pressing against people in public.
Mm-hmm.
It was like very specific, of like this like sexual fantasy or this fetish of like, being pressed against someone in public or fondling someone in public. And it got me thinking about, you know, arousal, sex. They're these very primal things. We've been doing it forever, since caveman times. Like, this is just a part of who we are because we're animals and we procreate and we have sex, and certain things are, sexually arousing to us. But there seems to be, when you start to look into it, so many kinks and fetishes and these like very specific things that people find to be arousing, like inanimate objects, or
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they're just like endless.
Mm-hmm.
Do our minds have the ability to make anything sexual and like anything arousing? Or is it that, as our society becomes more complex, our sexual minds and our sexual lives inevitably become more complex? Because I can't imagine that prehistoric cavemen had, a fantasy of
Mm-hmm.
pressing against people in public, because like that just wasn't a thing, that wasn't relevant for that society. So that is a fetish or a kink that has evolved as we've evolved. So I'm just curious your thoughts on, are we so much more sexually nuanced now just by way of the society we live in? Or do our minds just have the ability to essentially make anything sexual.
Right. Well, I'm going to answer the question in two ways. One, I would say is if a fantasy is working for you and it's working in your sex life and or it's working on your internet life, whatever it is, if it's working for you, why do you need to question it? As long as it's consensual and nobody's getting hurt, let's not try and psychoanalyze it or look for something. Let's just enjoy it, right? And we could come up with a narrative or story, but I can't at all tell you that we're coming up with the right story or the right narrative for why something is a fantasy or sexy. I do know that people have core erotic themes that persist over a lifetime. So things that turned us on at ages 5, 7, 10, 11, 13, 25, 30, 50, they persist, right? There are core themes that turn us on. And again, if it's working for you, like don't trouble unless trouble troubles you, like let it be, right? But I work with a lot of people who have problematic fantasies. Their fantasy life troubles them in some way, or it can lead them into trouble in some way. And if we have a second, I'll give you a quick example of that. I was working with a patient who the only way he could really get aroused was by having sex with someone when they were asleep or like unconscious. He had a big sleep sex fantasy, and he loved sleep sex porn, and he actually loved role playing this scenario. And he'd never done anything like what Bill Cosby had done. He had never purposefully gone across the lines of consent, but there had been some things with, over drinking when he was younger, and sort of people sort of half blacked out a little bit, and him getting very turned on. So he felt like this fantasy was very problematic because he wanted to get aroused in other ways, and it could lead to trouble. And he was ultimately a very lovely, ethical person. So we had to sort of, to your point, we had to sort of understand, like, what is this about, or why is this about? Why is this fantasy a fantasy? And for a long time, we really couldn't figure it out. Look, when someone's asleep, they're not judging you. Maybe you don't have to perform. So in that way, maybe it was a fantasy that was about the relief from anxiety. Remember, fantasies are our allies. So if I'm approaching sex and I'm very afraid of being judged, or my penis is too small, or I'm not going to be able to perform well, that fantasy of somebody being asleep is going to be a real turn on, because in the fantasy I'm not being judged, right? But we explored that for a little while. We explored, had he experienced trauma, right? Because as soon as people are having problems with sex or problem with fantasies, they wonder, was I traumatized as a child and I just don't remember it? Did I repress this traumatic memory? So we explored that a little bit, and then we kind of came across something that was really interesting, that I think really was sort of getting to the gold a little bit. When he was younger, when he was like 5, 6, 7, 10 years old, he was growing up an only child of a single mom, and his mother would work like 6 days a week, and Sunday was the only day that they could hang out together. But on Sunday, his mother was exhausted, and she'd want to, like sleep until noon. So he'd get in bed and he'd start trying to like tickle her or wake her up, and she'd like push him off, and he'd be bored and lonely and just want his mom and want that love and attention that he had been waiting for Sunday. And it just brought up, there were just so many memories of neglect in his life, in that relationship, and especially that image of Sunday morning and like someone that could have woken up to give him that love and attention and wasn't. And so in some ways the fantasy was kind of trying to take something that had been very painful for him as a memory that had been sort of stored in the unconscious, and kind of re-engage it or reenact it, and I think remaster it through the lens of pleasure. So that was an example. It was a case I worked on a long, long time ago, so I don't even remember that I'm getting all the details completely right. But that was an example where that insight really led to a kind of a flood of memories and emotion and sadness that was really able to open up in a way in him that had been incredibly guarded. And ultimately that fantasy loosened up. It was still a turn on. It was still a core erotic theme that had persisted for many years, but it was no longer like a rigid theme. It was
Right.
no longer as we would think of as a fetish.
Right. It's interesting because I think about what has been, I guess, somewhat widely accepted as the potential downside of porn. Like, I have nothing against porn. I think it's, perfectly healthy to view and watch together with a partner, but that it can only maybe become an issue if we are training ourselves to like only get off to a certain thing, or you
Mhm.
know I mean, I guess in some instances, knowing what turns you on and what gets you off is healthy, and that's something that maybe should be nurtured. But is there also, I guess, the potential risk of becoming really rigid
Mhm.
in your, what arouses you or what gets you off?
Sure. I mean, I think we jump to a lot of alarmist conclusions around porn. I think ultimately porn can just like watching Netflix or watching anything, it can play a very healthy role in our lives, and a lot of couples are watching. I mean, I would only say to watch ethical porn, which means you have to pay something for it. But I mean, I think porn is largely has a very positive impact on people's individual lives as well as their lives as couples in terms of just bringing in erotic material. But I guess you're asking, can it become problematic? Can somebody get, rigid in their fantasies, or can they develop a version of porn sex that doesn't really resemble real sex and then not enjoy real sex? Is that sort of what you're asking? Can porn kind of contribute to a kind of sexual, like being sexually myopic in a way, or
Or even outside of porn, if it's just, you've one position or just one scenario, like if you're very limited in what ultimately arouses you, like if you're with a partner where he has to be kind of like choking you or something to get off, like
Mhm.
just when you find yourself in these patterns where it's like, okay, in order to get off I have to be
Yeah.
doing this and this, like is that is that fine because hey, that's what gets you off, and so long as your partner's cool with it? Or is that potentially a downside because now you're sort of limiting any?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would ask, does it get you off as well? Does it get both partners off? And if it does get both partners off, like how much of a charge does it hold and for how long? Or at what point are you going to need a recharge? But if something's working really well, you don't have to question it, just if it's, one thing. I also don't buy into this idea of anybody being really like having to be sexually rigid. Like I hear this all the time. I can only have intercourse, or I can only get off from manual stimulation or from oral sex, or I always have to be a bottom, or I always have to be a top. Those are social constructs. Those aren't actual facts about our sexuality. They're things that we think, but I always try and challenge that because I think that arousal has just so much heat and can create so much heat in different ways. I think the issue is, like we live in a world with all of this amazing porn, all of this amazing like audio erotica, all these amazing sex toys, and most of that we're using with ourselves most of the time. So we have these very rich, interesting, psychological, masturbatory lives, and we're completely relaxed when we're doing it. Like, nobody's looking over my shoulder. I don't have to perform. Nobody's judging me. I know just how to touch myself or just how to use that vibrator. And so, in that way, hopefully, masturbation is kind of easy and kind of fun and kind of anxiety free and a great outlet. The problem is that when you're having sex with an actual human being, you got to talk about it and you got to communicate about it and you got to understand their interests and preferences and turn ons and turn offs. So it's not so easy. It's not so easy. It can be amazing. It can be wonderful. I mean, I personally think being able to like dance with somebody as opposed to being able to dance with myself is, to be preferred. But I got to invest in learning that dance, and I can't expect to just do it
Mhm.
suddenly and easily. So I think real sex is in some ways a little more anxiety provoking, a little harder. We often will end up then blaming porn or blaming the sex toys. Oh, I'm a vibrator addict now. I can only get off with my vibrator. Oh, I can only get off watching, femdom tickle torture porn. Oh, my vibrator's ruined me. My porn has fucked up my brain and rewired me. Don't blame the vibrator. Don't blame the porn. Look at your lived actual sex life and what needs to happen there and what needs to improve there.
Yeah. Yeah. Here, here. I mean, it is hard. I feel like it's hard a lot for people to talk to their partners about sex or
Mm-hmm.
about what they like, or, you know, to really get into, some of the stuff that maybe really turns them on,
Yeah.
even when they might be like very connected otherwise.
Take the leap is what I would say. Take the leap. Sometimes I'll say, well, sometimes someone will come in with like a problem, like sex is so quick, or it's boring, it's not adventurous, and I'll say, okay, that's the problem. What's the solution? Oh, the solution is much more oral sex, or not being so focused on orgasm, or having sex, outside, or getting kinky. Oh, that's the solution. Great. What's sexy about that? Oh, I'm going to feel like I'm going to feel a body in this way. Then they start to actually put some skin on a fantasy. And we've gone from, a problem to a solution to a fantasy. And then I'll say to somebody, okay, go share that with your partner. And they'll be like, are you crazy? I could never. I was like, so you're going to tell me, a stranger, I guess it's easier, right? You're going to tell me, but you're not going to share it with the one person right now, unless you're polyamorous or non-monogamous, and we could talk about that as well. But you're not going to share it with, that intimate partner. And then I'll say, okay, well, could you ever present it like you had a sexy dream and you don't know what your unconscious was thinking, but like you had this crazy sexy dream? Like, there's got to be a way to begin to use the language of arousal.
What would you, in your book, tell me about the last time you had sex, and you investigate these sort of sex scripts, and then you talk about kind of giving couples homework assignments to work on, in between sessions with you. What's an example of an assignment that a couple would have? Like, let's say if they're just somewhat mismatched in terms of, maybe getting on the same page with arousal, or they're kind of into different things, or they're just kind of, maybe there's no major dysfunction, but it's just like a relatively healthy couple that, is
Right.
looking to
So
just
it might be like a relatively healthy couple that always had great sex, but now just sex is becoming a little boring, and it's kind of like, a series of positions and moves that kind of feel good, but they just don't end up really being a huge turn on. And so that this is a couple then that needs more psychological arousal in their sex script, right? They need more, like, they can't just rely on their bodies to create arousal. They need to rely on their minds. And our minds can generate as much as arousal as our bodies, right? Women can fantasize their way to orgasms if they want to. Men can get completely hands-free erections just from watching something or fantasizing about something. So what I might give them a homework assignment, right? They'll agree. We need a little more of an arousal runway into the sex. So I usually have an assignment. I call it a willingness window. It's a window of time. It's a little cheesy sounding, I know, a willingness window. But it's a window of time that's being allocated to do an activity, to do this assignment that we all agree on. And it's a willingness window because I'm expecting when the time comes, one or both of you are not going to have an actual desire to do this assignment, but you've decided it's important and you do have the willingness. And where there's willingness, there's a way. I can work with any couple on any issue as long as there's some degree of mutual willingness. If one partner doesn't have that willingness, I'm just totally done. I'm not attracted to this person. I never was. We've always had terrible sex. I don't know why I'm here. I was dragged here. I'm no willingness to do your window assignment. It's going to be hard for me to work with that couple. And then we'll come up with activities. We'll say, so what can we do psychogenically, psychologically in that willingness window? And it's not about having sex. It's not about touching each other. It's just about, in this particular case, can we get turned on just with our minds, right? So then we'll come up with a specific exercise. Maybe there's something that they can do that's face to face, really just talking to each other or sharing something or acting something, playing make-believe in some ways, which seems so crazy for us as adults. Meanwhile, you watch any two 5-year-olds in a playground, there's more cops and robbers, heroes and villains. There's more power play happening in the playground than there is in, most of our bedrooms, but we're too embarrassed to go back there. So if someone's too embarrassed, then that's where I'll bring in this whole sort of renaissance in ethical porn and, or reading aloud, and I'll get them to, in a sort of a side-by-side way, to start taking in that material. But my goal is to get in that particular assignment, to get some psychological arousal into the system.
Yeah, I have a friend who's just not at all. She just has no interest, and it's her partner does not feel the same. So, she's just not, it doesn't really seem to do anything for her, but it did in the beginning, right? Like when they first started dating, it was one of the things she loved about, him and them being together. And it was so hot for her. It's this sense of like, I don't feel pursued really. There's no like lead up. I don't feel like I'm being, just like coveted, I guess, in the same way that there's this sort of like lackadaisical approach that just really doesn't do it for her. But she's just, not such a sexual person. And, it's truly only, I guess, an issue in the sense that her partner just doesn't feel the same. So there's that mismatch there.
That comes back to our first point we were talking about. These two people are in different desire frameworks. So he's in a spontaneous desire framework. He thinks about sex more. He's more sexually activated. It's like being at an amusement park. He has a fast pass and he can get right on the ride. And it's like, why doesn't she have a fast pass? Why won't she come on that ride with me? And she's like, I don't know that I have any pass. I don't even know your poor friend to start thinking that she's like a non-sexual person. She's in a different desire framework where there needs to be the generation of some kind of arousal, the percolation, the simmering of arousal that can lead to the emergence of desire. But she can probably, if things were set up correctly in the sex script, she could probably get to desire in as forthright and as a palpable way as her partner. The other concept that gets talked about a lot is this idea that the sexual brain has two systems that operate at once, an excitation system and an inhibition system. So your excitation system is like stepping on the gas in a car, and your inhibition system is like stepping on the brake. So for your partner, I would say, what are the turn-ons? And she might say, what are the accelerators, the exciters? And she might say, you already said being pursued, feeling desired, right? Does she have other accelerators, other exciters that you know about? It could be anything. It could be like a particular position, oral sex. It could be having dinner made when she comes home, or having the dishes cleaned if they're living together and cohabiting. Are there other things that turn her on about her? Forget the dishes for a second, but are there other things that could turn her on or excite her?
I mean, I think her, like, she's sensitive to her partner's appearance. So I know she was in the, like tall men with beard, like that's, very appealing to her. Or someone I think kind of in a position of like power or
Okay.
authority is something that's like attractive to
Okay.
her. Um,
Okay.
and yeah, I mean, in terms, it's interesting because with some of her past partners, she was like much more had like, was much more excitable. And I don't know if it's, speaking to a broader issue in this current
Okay, well let's
relationship,
talk
but
about that. So some of her exciters are being desired, playing with power, certain physical attributes that this guy either has or doesn't have. And maybe if we talked as well, there'd be certain places she likes to be touched or getting massaged or some kind of something or other that turns her on, right? That really creates arousal. But she also has a break, right? There are things that turn her off. She actually is probably maybe turned off by this guy's appearance, although there's other things that she really loves about him. Do you know other things that turn her off? You were talking about past relationships, but in this relationship, what would be a turnoff? And remember, a turnoff can be a kid in the other
yeah.
room, a dog in the bed, dishes in the sink, work to do, a mother who just like scolded you.
I know like he wants to have sex more often, so whenever he's kind of like almost like naggy or like it's almost
Okay.
like she gets turned off by his attempts to turn her on, if that makes sense.
Sure, sure. So his sort of neediness is a
Yeah.
turn off, right? So and I bet you with your friend that if you look at all of the exciters and all the inhibitors and you put them on a scale, my guess is the inhibitors are going to weigh a lot more, right?
Mhm.
Than the things that turn her off right now in the environment. And it could also be things that are in her direct environment, or it could be the bigger environment. Maybe she's has anxiety and is on an SSRI, or maybe there was some sort of medical procedure. Maybe there's some grieving. Who knows? It's just something that's happening in the world or with her job, right? But my guess is that the stressors in her life, that foot on the brake is very strong. So it's very, very hard to accelerate. So what I would work with them as a couple, because they both have to be part of the work, like actually his spontaneous desire is cool. It's sort of like a tap on the shoulder. Hey, let's be a little sexual with each other. If that went away, then where would they be? They'd never have sex. So it's like, how could he use that tap on the shoulder, but work with her to create an environment where she can take the foot off the brake and start to step on the gas? And that becomes, in my book and in my concept of sex scripts, creating a shared desire framework.
Mhm. I'll send her this link
Okay.
of the interview to watch. Cause yeah, I'm like, it's affecting their relationship. So
Absolutely. Sex, they say couples therapists say that when sex is working, it's about 20% of a overall relationship. Personally, but I'm a sex therapist and I love sex. I put it a little higher than that. But the point is, when you're not having sex or you're not in a good sex life, it becomes like 80% of your concern.
you mentioned, some women who can get themselves off completely mentally. Um, and I'm just interested to know a little bit more about that because I can do that and like frequently orgasm in my sleep, like when I'm between sleep and awake. It's
Mhm.
like I consider it a superpower because I feel like I can actually mentally like give myself an orgasm.
Mhm.
And it happened somewhat recently, like within the past like 5 years, I would say. Like I used to fly a lot in my dreams and now I like orgasm a lot in my dreams.
Mhm.
But it's like I'm like semi-conscious too. But it happens like all the time.
Mhm.
Not to the point where it's an issue or it's a new nuisance in any way, but just often. And I'm just curious,
Mhm.
is like, does the brain just sort of go there naturally, or like what have you found with that?
Well, for your next interview, you should interview someone. Her name's Nan Wise, and she's a neuroscientist and a therapist, and she's done a lot of research into, the female brain. And, you know, um, what I would sort of say is, I would sort of say a few things. One, that fantasy on it is very powerful, and fantasy does create a lot of physical arousal. Two, I would say, um, you know, when you are masturbating, you are encoding a way of touching yourself that works, that you don't have to think about, that you can just do, right? You're not thinking about how you're touching yourself. You're just doing it, right? And so you are encoding in a part of the brain that stores routines and makes them effortless, a series of touch-based behaviors. When you're having a fantasy, you're also in a way encoding a mental set of images that can also stimulate the part of the brain that's associated with sexual sensation. And when you're fantasizing or when you're asleep, you're probably at your most disinhibited, right? A lot of people wake up, they have their best sex in the morning because they're kind of just disinhibited. They're like, their stressed out selves haven't woken up yet, and their sensual selves got up a little earlier, so they're more disinhibited. When I work with men who have ED, very often just waking up and being relaxed and being next to someone is sort of the best time to sort of get an erection. So anyway, I think that it's sort of all about the relationship between your fantasies and a part of the brain called the somatosensory cortex that's responsible for processing sexual sensation. But again, the research on this is fairly speculative, but like someone like Nan Wise would be cool to talk to.
I will definitely look her up. Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. I mean, I could keep going, but I want to.
Maybe we'll do it again.
Yeah, because I still have
coming in 8 minutes. So
okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate it. And this was very insightful, and definitely hope to chat with you again soon.
Thanks, Nomi.
Cool. Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.